Greetings, humans of the internet. Welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you, as usual, from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA, with some more historic insights. And I figured that since today is the 31st of October, or Halloween as it has been come to be known, it would be a good time to discuss the history of American horror fiction, because, well, it is quite a story. So, prepare for all things that go bump in the night as I discuss the history of American horror fiction. Now, as is often the case, for the history of American horror fiction, we first have to look across the pond. Now, the history of horror fiction has very ancient origins, with roots in various folklore and religious traditions. Now, in Plutarch's The Lives of Noble Grecians and Romans, there is an account of a man named Damon who was a restless spirit who haunted the bathhouse in which he was murdered. However, it wasn't until 1764 that the foundation of horror as we know it was officially laid, when a book called The Castle of Otranto by Henry Walpole was written, which followed the life of a prince as he marries his son's intended wife after his son's unusual death and the supernatural events that follow. This is the novel that coined the term Gothic in relation to horror, as well as employing many elements used in the greater horror genre, such as supernatural elements and descriptions of dread-inducing architecture. Many readers and critics thought the novel was written in poor taste. However, it went on to influence many stories and novels. The Romantic period, with a capital R, of the late 18th and early 19th centuries was when horror fiction took on the shape of what we know today. Classics were published during this period, such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus, which has been called both the first real horror novel and the first science fiction novel. And of course, just 1 year later, in 1820, American author Washington Irving wrote and published his story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. He would write many ghost stories and Gothic subject matter, and in 1836, a story called The Pride of the Village was published. Washington Irving would follow that with a sort of sequel called A Chronicle of Wolfert's Roost, and in that he told a series of legends, ghost stories, and superstitions surrounding the Von Tassel farmhouse. Irving himself bought the property when he returned from Europe and renamed it Sunnyside, and he lived there for years. And he related genuine local superstitions about his house, including how Sleepy Hollow was cursed by a Native American wizard and how it was cursed by witches, including one who lived in his home. Some of the wartime adventures of the historical Von Tassel family and a series of ghosts whom he saw himself, including a weeping female in his orchard, and a skeleton who was doomed to roll past his house for eternity. And of course, no piece on the history of American horror fiction would be complete without the master of all things Gothic, Edgar Allan Poe. He was dismissed for many years as nothing but an alcoholic hack, but he is now gaining his rightful place in the literary canon, and not just as a writer of horror literature. His suggestive prose style carries him through several volumes of startlingly original short stories and some heartbreaking poetry. And he is also credited with inventing the modern detective story, which was The Murders in the Rue Morgue in 1841. Poe found base in Baltimore, Maryland, where in 1833 he wrote a story called M.S. Found in a Bottle, which won $50 from a Baltimore weekly, and by 1835 he was in Richmond, Virginia as the editor of the Southern Literary Messenger. There he made a name as a critical reviewer and married a young woman named Virginia Clem, who was his first cousin, and she was only 13. And later, in 1839, a book he wrote called Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque appeared, and he resigned from a newspaper at around 1840 but returned in 1841 to its successor, Graham's Lady and Gentleman magazine, in which he printed The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which, as previously stated, was the first detective story. And in 1843, he wrote another short story called The Gold Bug and won a prize of $100 from the Philadelphia Dollar newspaper, which gave him great publicity. And in 1844, he returned to New York and wrote The Balloon Hoax for the Sun magazine and became sub-editor of the New York Mirror under the name N.P. Willis. 1845, more January 29th, Edgar Allan Poe's most famous poem, The Raven, was published in New York Mirror magazine. And interestingly, he sold it for $10. Man, just goes to show you that people have been stiffing authors for about as long as there's been authors. And needless to say, Poe did contribute quite a bit to the development of the Gothic horror genre in American literature. He significantly shaped the Gothic genre in America by infusing it with psychological depth and exploring themes like death and madness. In his works, often featured dark settings and complex characters, which have become hallmarks of Gothic fiction. For example, The Telltale Heart, in which the main character is a servant who has been driven close to madness and believes that his employer's bad eye is evil. And short stories came into full form during the early 20th century. Prominent serials such as Weird Tales and Unknown Worlds became famous for serialized fiction, and a popular horror comic series that ran from and stories about serial murderers also became popular during this period, sometimes featuring real murderers like Jack the Ripper and Ed Gein. And no discussion of American horror would be complete without H.P. Lovecraft, a man who specialized in writing weird tales, which was a term he often used to describe his own work, as well as cosmic horror. Supernatural themes and elements were common threads in his work. H.P. Lovecraft wrote dozens of short stories, some novellas, and one complete novel called The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. And he was also one of the first authors to create a shared universe which was in his case called the Cthulhu Mythos, which connected many of his stories. A unifying theme in his works is that humans are small and largely irrelevant in the cosmic scheme of things. And in a letter to the editor of Weird Tales magazine, Lovecraft once wrote, "Now my tales are based on the fundamental premise that common human laws and interests and emotions have no validity or significance in the vast cosmos at large." And sadly, H.P. Lovecraft was largely unknown during his lifetime. Today, however, his work has achieved a near legendary status. Many of today's well-known writers, including Stephen King and Neil Gaiman, have cited Lovecraft as one of their early influences. And it should also be noted H.P. Lovecraft was an inspiration for one of my favorite writers in television, Rod Serling. And now, after talking about so many prominent male writers, I think it's now time to honor the lady of horror fiction. Well, one of the ladies, and that, of course, is Shirley Jackson. She wrote 6 novels and more than 200 short stories, and while she wrote across multiple genres, she is best known for her work within the horror genre in particular. In 1959, she published The Haunting of House Hill, which cemented her position as one of the greatest Gothic horror writers of her time. Hill House was one of the first, and some would say one of the best, haunted house novels in America or anywhere else, and it has been certainly influential. Jackson's novel was adapted for film twice under the shortened title The Haunting, once in 1963 and again in 1999. Her novel, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, was made into a film in 2018, and the latest adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House was a Netflix miniseries that same year. A feature film based on her most famous short story, The Lottery, is currently in development. She's been called a sorceress of plot mechanics that managed to combine outright terror and biting wit. Her work influenced an untold legion of writers, but notably Richard Matheson, another writer for The Twilight Zone, Neil Gaiman, and America's master of horror, Stephen King. She received several major awards during her lifetime, including a Mystery Writers of America Award, an Edgar Allan Poe Award for Best Short Story for Louisa, Please Come Home in 1961, and a National Book Award nomination for Hill House in 1960. Now gives me a chance to talk about one of the greatest writers of horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and a man I consider an inspiration, Ray Bradbury. He won awards, inspired generations of writers, and brought critical legitimacy to genre fiction. He moved as easily between fiction, comics, and screenwriting, and delighted audience of all ages. His inner child led him to write touching tales for children like The Halloween Tree, but he was just as capable of writing white-knuckle horror, such as his novel This Way, Something Wicked This Way Comes, which combined both of those skill sets. Telling a harrowing and emotional coming-of-age story, Ray Bradbury wrote more than 400 short stories and novelettes, and he remains one of the most prolific visionaries of any genre. And in 1951, the Saturday Evening Post published his short story, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, also called The Foghorn. The sea monster would later be made into a film in 1953, which would go on to trigger the giant monster fad of the 1950s. In another deeply unsettling piece of fiction written by Bradbury, The World the Children Made, shows how well Bradbury understood both the good and bad of children. And no piece on the history of American horror stories would be complete without the master of all things gory, Stephen King. The man has influenced the horror genre in general and American horror in particular, more than any other living writer, or dead writer for that matter. He authored such works as Carrie, Salem's Lot, The Shining, The Stand, Pet Sematary, and It, just to name a few. Now, as Stephen King was beginning to gain traction, other authors began to do the same during the 1970s, which has been called the golden age of horror novels in America. Of course, many of the novels I had just mentioned were adapted into different forms of media, some more faithful than others. I'm looking at you, The Shining. In the 1970s, horror novels began to enjoy greater commercial success and more widespread readership. And prior to that, they were largely the stuff of fringe readers and quote-unquote weirdos. They were not mainstream. But in the 70s, that began to change. Horror novels started popping up on bestsellers lists. They became household names. Mainly literary critics and historians considered the 70s to be the start of the contemporary horror period in America, though that term is a slippery one to say the least. The 1970s gave us many great American horror novels, including The Exorcist, Hell House by Richard Matheson, Carrie by Stephen King, Jaws by Peter Benchley, Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice, The Omen by David Seltzer, The Amityville Horror by Jay Anson, and Ghost Story by Peter Straub. During the 1970s, horror novels emerged from the shadows and entered the mainstream. They sold well for the most part. Interestingly, the paperback version of Stephen King's Carrie sold over 1 million copies just during its first year alone. These books would also be adapted to the big screen, as I previously mentioned, where they earned blockbuster status. And this boom would continue into the 1980s. But it faded during the second half of the decade. In terms of bestsellers and breakthroughs within the genre, the 80s pale in comparison to the 70s. Still, the decade did give us some notable works of dark fiction. These included The Elementals by Michael McDowell, Legion by William Peter Blatty, The Woman in Black by Susan Hill, It by Stephen King, Swan Song by Robert McCammon, The Queen of the Damned by Anne Rice, and The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris, which, of course, would later become a famous movie. I was trying to do the Hannibal Lecter slurping sounds, but it didn't show up so well in the microphone. Sorry. Anyway, and of course, during the 2000s, there was another renewal in the interest of horror. Notable trends within this past decade include Stephen King's It was adapted for the big screen twice, with both movies enjoying commercial success. Josh Malerman's 2014 novel Bird Box became a hit and was later adapted into a Netflix movie. And another adaptation of Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, was made as previously stated. And who knows what will happen next. And with that, humans of the internet, I'm afraid I must leave you. It's getting late here and I'm getting very tired. And the last thing I want is nightmares. And well, what have we learned? I think we've learned that if something is not popular during one decade, it could become very popular the next. And things change. We call it progress. And before I leave, I would like to thank the people at CornetFiction.com, the SaturdayEveningPost.com, OldStyleTales.com, Fiveable.me, and HorrorFilmsHistory.com for the information I used to make this episode. Thank you, goodbye, and God bless. And if you go out tonight, be careful, because what may be lurking in the shadows could be a werewolf or vampire or who knows. It might even be me. Sorry.